Well done. Well done. Thank you so much. We're so glad you're here. Isn't this a wonderful turnout? So if I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting you, my name is Denise Van Buren, and I'm the 2023 president for the Beacon Historical Society. It's a role I filled about 35 years ago, and I'm a retread. I'm back. But just like Beacon, so much has changed with the Beacon Historical Society since I was president many, many years ago. And I think you'll agree after tonight's presentation that we have a lot of exciting stuff going on, and that it's really just a privilege to be a part of it at this time of so much change in Beacon's past. So why don't we, once we get our chairs set up, now that you're all settled in and comfy, I'm going to ask you to rise so that we can begin our meeting with a pledge to the flag of the United States of America. So if you would, please join me, placing your hand over your heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And again, thank you for being here. 2023 is off to a great year for us at the Beacon Historical Society. This is our first programmatic meeting of the year, but our membership continues to grow, our collection continues to grow, and awareness of what makes Beacon such a great place to live and work continues to grow, and we'd like to think that we play a part in that. We also are delighted to tell you that we're raising funds for central air conditioning in our headquarters. I think most of you probably know we're now located at 61 Leonard Street, the former St. Joachim's Rectory. It's a magnificent space for us, 3 floors, almost 3 times the space we had in our prior location, but hotter than you know where in the summertime. So hard to get volunteers and certainly hard to get visitors to attend when you have temperature, I think, on the 3rd floor that got to over 100 degrees last summer. So we took a brave step of getting an invoice and an estimate on central air conditioning, and I'm just so thrilled to tell you that just this week the central air conditioning has been installed. So a round of applause for Gary Barrick, our Housing and Grounds, Diane Lapis, and all the other trustees that helped us. A big project for an organization our size, about a $30,000 investment into our headquarters here, and we're still fundraising to be able to complete that project financially. On a happy, fun note, I wanted to tell those of you who'd been following us in our earlier newsletter and at our Christmas open house, you may recall that we were the fortunate recipients of a Cutter sleigh from the 1850s that had once been at the Craig House Hospital. It had traveled to Putnam County. It had spent some time, and then it had been up at Locust Grove for decades. And we were so thrilled in December to take receipt of it here, returning it to Beacon after nearly 60 years of being out of the city. And I just wanted to share with you an update that at the end of this month, my husband and I are driving it to Amish country, where a carriage reupholsterer and restoration company, their Amish farmers, are going to be restoring the carriage for us from the 1850s. So we're excited for that. June is our postcard show, and it is always a popular draw for it. It's a fundraiser for us too, and maybe at the end, if you have any questions, Diane could likely answer them. It's held right here in the St. Joachim School Hall. We're grateful for that. So much of what we're able to do happens because of a great spirit of volunteers. And I wanted to publicly recognize all of our volunteers who help us at the headquarters and with special events. And I certainly wanted to give a shout out to our trustees who are so well compensated. And yet obviously love us so much because they give so much of themselves to us, and we're so grateful. And there could not be a better example of that than tonight's presenter, Diane Lapis. Diane has become the foremost expert on a number of really specialized and really unique parts of Beacon's history. For example, Camp Nishkadagat and our Jewish history. Did I not even come close? What is it? Nishkadagat. Okay. Nishkadagat. See why it's so important we talk about these things so we learn how to pronounce them? And the Jewish history of Beacon, and Harry Van Tyne, who is the subject of this evening's lecture, but also the subject of our current exhibition, which will be running through May. Please come in. We're just about to get started with our program. We'd love to have you join us. Barbara, is there any other cars in the parking lot? One more. Okay. The rest of them are obviously going to Bible study. So welcome aboard. So with that, let me just recognize Diane for the hours and hours and hours of time that she has devoted to this topic. I don't think she minds one bit because her passion for the story of Harry Van Tyne is contagious, and I think you'll all feel that same kind of excitement over our city's connection to this exemplary early photographer after hearing her presentation tonight. So Diane, with that, take it away.
Thank you, Denise. And thank you all for coming this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I am beyond thrilled to share my research with you all. So tonight's presentation will be about Beacon's native son, Harry Van Tyne, and I will share with you my research findings about Harry and bring his contributions to light based on his essays and his body of work. So the story begins here. Right here, where when I moved to Beacon 15 years ago with when I married my husband Peter, I joined the Historical Society to meet friends, and as a postcard collector and aficionado, I offered to organize the postcard collection. And Bob Murphy, who was the former president and city historian, informed me that most of the postcards were made by a man named Harry Van Tyne, which meant nothing to me. But when I saw this photograph of the exterior of the Van Tyne stationery store, I asked Bob who was this person reflecting in the doorway. And he said it was none other than Harry Van Tyne, the photographer who took the photograph and later became a White House News photographer. And for some reason, I got hooked. And I said, I must learn more about Harry Van Tyne. And we did have a slim file of information at the Historical Society about Harry and about Robert Van Tyne, whom I'm going to start the presentation about. So I'm going to move forward. Robert was Harry's father, and he was a prominent business owner on Main Street, what was at that time called Fishkill Landing, which would later become Beacon. He owned the store from 1880 until his death in 1941. Van Tyne's, in its second store at 177 Main Street, which is now Zaka Joy, was one of the longest running stores on Main Street. The store was the largest newspaper dealer in the Hudson Valley and also sold magazines, records, books, school and office supplies, stationery, toys, sporting goods, and most importantly, for the discussion of the story, cameras. So Van Tyne's was a meeting place for neighbors and friends to discuss local and national politics and world events. Robert employed hundreds of people in the 60 years that he owned the store. He was active in our community as a member of the Tompkins Hose Fire Company and director of the Fishkill National Bank. Robert and his wife Elizabeth Moore had one son, Harry, who was born in 1885. We don't have records of Harry in attendance at Fishkill Landing School, but we know that Robert attended there, and we know that Harry took these photographs, so one would assume that would be where he went to high school. And he probably graduated in 1904. It was noted in the local papers that Harry started to work as a clerk at Van Tyne's when he turned 18. He did, however, spend more of his time as a reporter for the Matawan Journal and the Newburgh Daily News. And you can see this is the Daily News building in Newburgh on a color postcard. I think it came from the Newburgh Historical Society collection, thanks to Mary McTammany. Van Tyne lived during an incredible time of change at the turn of the 20th century. Advances in transportation, technology, industry, communication, and a host of new inventions transformed our nation and laid the framework for the modern era. Growing up in Beacon, Van Tyne was witness to these changes and captured them through his photographic works. His early images from the 1900s were made into postcards and form an important record of life here. The timing was right for Harry as a budding photographer at the turn of the century. He had easy access to the latest Kodak gear and supplies from his father's store. The postcard craze was flourishing, and thousands of tourists and locals were visiting Mount Beacon. So, photographing, printing, and selling postcards to sell at the store was a winning proposition. Harry's postcard images capture key events, places, and people in Beacon and local neighboring communities. And you can see some of the advertisements from the local newspapers selling Kodak supplies. The postcards were sold at curio stands on Mount Beacon, averaging between 100 and 500 per day. And also selling, of course, at Van Tyne's for 2 for a nickel. It's easy to identify a Van Tyne postcard, as the name is clearly printed on the back of the card, as illustrated here. An inventory of Van Tyne postcards reveal that he created over 250 cards. A thorough discussion on the history of the Van Tyne cards was published in an article I wrote for the Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook and is available to read on our website. The majority of Harry's photo images were printed on glass plate negatives and sent to Germany to be mass-produced into postcards. The process for printing cards was well established there at the turn of the century. So here are a few images from the glass plate negatives next to their accompanying postcard. We are fortunate to have a few examples of the actual glass plates that were found at Van Tyne's store upon Harry's death. Jean Trifolo Sr. bought Van Tyne's and found the plates in the cellar of the store and saved them. Notice this, this is like 1 second different. You can see a little bit of change in the people's, where they're standing. In addition to the printed cards, Harry also produced real photo cards that capture specific events, such as parades, actors that made movies on the mountain, fire calls, and the Hudson-Fulton celebration. Van Tyne was an active member of the Lewis Tompkins Hose Fire Company, starting in 1904, and became an active honorary in 1910, and then life member in 1935. You can see Van Tyne in the middle row, third from the left. He's right on the crease there. Let's see. And Van Tyne was responsible for many of the early photos of this fire company. The Historical Society is thankful to Denny Leahy for his careful record keeping of every member of the Tompkins Hose Company since its inception. Denny is a 63-year volunteer member of Tompkins Hose. In 1908, Harry marries Florence Glover. Their first apartment is in the Rogers Building in Fishkill, and soon thereafter moved to 11 Willow Street. Here's the building they were in Fishkill. They live across the street from Robert and Elizabeth, his parents, at 8 Willow Street, and just around the corner from the store and the firehouse. Florence and Harry have one son named Ronald, who was born in 1911. As an adult, Ronald worked for the United Press International from 1930 to 1948. He worked for the War Production Board and served in the Army Armed Forces in Europe during World War II. After the war, he worked for 3 Philadelphia newspapers. Ronald had 2 children, Louise and Patty. By way of serendipity, I was able to track down Ronald's daughter, or Harry's granddaughter, Louise Patak. The photo on the left is Louise as a young child. What do you notice on the table? The old flash bulbs? Good old Harry. I visited Louise at her home, where she shared stories of Harry and allowed me the opportunity to look through Harry's suitcase. It was filled with photos, scrapbooks, personal narratives, postcards, and letters. I was able to follow the trajectory of Harry's early life in Beacon through the scrapbooks to his work as a photojournalist at the Capitol. Ronald's other daughter, Patty, had a child named Mark Kimbrough. He lives in Nevada and shared some of his photos as well. Fortunately, Harry wrote a number of essays that recalled the people and events that he encountered in his life as a news photographer. Harry's writing made him come alive. The essay, Through the Eye of the Camera, was a 50-year reflection on his work. Don't Shoot featured people that refused to have their photo taken, such as J.P. Morgan, who nearly hit Harry on the head with his cane. Other essays included the history of the Van Tyne store, the story of Harry Thaw and Evelyn Nesbit, which I'll talk about later, D.W. Griffith's shooting film on Mount Beacon, and a brief autobiography. The exhibition at the Society and tonight's presentation is based on Harry's writing. I was able to identify the photos in the suitcase based on the essays, and then found accompanying newspaper clippings that helped to put the photos into historical context. From his essay, Shooting with Griffin 40 Years Ago, Van Tyne recalls when D.W. Griffith of Biograph Studios of New York City directed 3 silent movies on Mount Beacon in 1909 and 1910. Harry was there as the only photographer taking still photos and was considered to be Griffith's first still photographer. The filming involved about 50 actors and crew members who took advantage of the mountain's amenities: Beacon Crest Hotel for costume changes and picnic lunches, dining and dancing at the casino, and ready use of burros, which we saw earlier in one of the postcards, for transport and cameo roles in the film. It took about 3 days to produce each film. Scenes were shot 3 to 4 times by cameraman Billy Blitzer, with Griffith shouting out prompts to the actors. The 3 films were Red Man's View, The Fugitive, and The Song of the Wildwood Flute, which starred a young Mary Pickford. According to the local paper, Van Tyne's photos of the actors were printed and sold as postcards at the store. In 1950, and then again in 1955, Van Tyne would send Pickford photos from the shooting of the film. Both times, Pickford would send a thank you letter back to Van Tyne. In 1920, Griffith's latest film, Way Down East, was screened at the White House for President Wilson. Harry met up with Griffith on the White House steps after the screening, and the 2 men reminisced about early movie making on Mount Beacon. Van Tyne is on the right. Harry catapulted his career as a journalist after he scooped a sensational news story for the Matawan Journal. Harry and fellow news reporter James V. Forrestal, later to become the Secretary of the Navy under Franklin D. Roosevelt and Secretary of Defense under Truman, were first on the scene the morning of August 17, 1913, after celebrity playboy and millionaire Harry Thaw escaped from the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. In attempts at protecting the honor of his wife, Evelyn Nesbit, Thaw murdered famed architect Stanford White, her former benefactor and lover. Nesbit started her career as a model at age 14 in 1900. Her bewitching smile and intoxicating looks made her an overnight sensation. White and Nesbit had a year-long tryst, even though White was married and 30 years her senior. A few years later, Thaw would marry Nesbit, but believed White was his romantic rival. On the evening of June 25th, 1906, Thaw shot and killed White at the Madison Square Theater in front of a large audience. After 2 trials, Thaw was deemed insane and sent to Matawan. While there, Thaw was given special treatment and was allowed to go into town on the pretext of visiting a dentist. While walking down the street, local residents would bow and say, "Good day, sir." Thaw shopped at Van Tyne's store, where he befriended Harry. He purchased books, magazines, newspapers, and operatic recordings. Harry photographed Thaw and Nesbit when she visited her husband at the asylum. While Van Tyne didn't witness Thaw's escape from the insane asylum, his photos were used to illustrate the news article written by Forrestal about the sensational escape. Edward McManus, a former resident of Beacon and friend, took note of Harry's photojournalistic work on the Thaw story. McManus was the president of the International Film Service, a subsidiary of the Hearst Corporation, and a noted film writer and originator of motion picture serials such as The Perils of Pauline. He invited Van Tine to work for the International Film Service in Manhattan in 1912, and 3 years later asked him to launch and manage a branch office in Washington, D.C. This was the start of Van Tine's career as a White House news photographer. In the intervening years before Van Tine headed to D.C., one of his amazing assignments was when he took flight on a Curtiss flying boat with aviator Beckwith Havens in October 29, 1913. The plane departed from a hangar at Chelsea to travel along the Hudson River. According to the Middletown Daily News Times, quote, Van Tine was the first newspaper man in this vicinity to venture into regions hitherto only inhabited by birds. 2 weeks prior to this event, Havens, a pioneer in early flight, flew John B. Verplanck, who was the first passenger from Albany to Staten Island over the Hudson, with a stop in Fishkill Landing for refueling. Many years later, in 1925, Van Tine assisted Havens by demonstrating aircraft to the Navy Department for the Macmillan Polar Expedition. The Navy purchased the equipment to assess areas previously unknown and used the new science of shortwave radio to maintain two-way contact with the rest of the world. When International Film Service added still picture service, the name changed to International News Photo. Here are some photos of Van Tine in Washington under the International News name. By 1918, Harry was one of the many news photographers working in the Capitol. Newspapers across the country were sending photographers to Washington, as many dignitaries were visiting there as World War I was heating up. News photographers did not have press passes, nor were they invited to photograph the business of government. Photographers would wait outside the gates of the White House in hopes of seeing someone who may have had an appointment with the president. They were often shooed away by the Secret Service and generally treated poorly by reporters and others. You can see Harry Van Tine in the third section. When President Wilson suffered a stroke in 1919 and was making few public appearances, news photographers vied for an opportunity to see the president. Harry, who is right there by the arrow that he drew himself, Harry and another photographer hid under a hay wagon, hay being delivered to the White House lawn for the sheep that grazed there, in hopes of catching a glimpse of the president as he took his morning walk. The Secret Service caught on and sent the photographers packing. It was the head of the Secret Service who suggested that the cameramen band together. So, a group of 24 movie and still photographers met and formed the White House News Photographers Association. And I quote from their mission, quote, whose purpose was to protect and promote photographers' access to the business of government in Washington, D.C. and beyond. Their core belief is that there is a direct linkage between the survival of a democratic society and an accurate and free press. They maintain the highest standards of ethical conduct, including truth, accuracy, and fairness, with images striving to be objective and independent. It was during the Harding administration that news photographers were given the opportunity to have access to the White House and other official events and programs. Harding was a former owner of a newspaper, and when he became president in March of 1921, he provided a press room, press passes, and a list of visitors for the news photographers to shoot. Harry became a founding member of that association. He held various titles over a period of 25 years, that of president, secretary, and treasurer. So again, I love the arrow that he drew on the hay wagon pointing to himself. While there are hundreds of stories and photos to share, I picked a few to share this evening. In Van In Van Tyne's essay, Through the Eye of a Camera, he states, quote, "My camera and I recorded faithfully those pioneers who blazed the way for women to become prominent in the affairs of the nation. Women like Carrie Chapman Catt, Mary Garrett Hay, Dr. Mary Walker," who's right here, "who is allowed to wear men's pants by an act of Congress, and Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin, the first woman in Congress." On June 4th, 1919, suffragists packed the Senate gallery as senators finally approved the national suffrage amendment with 2 votes to spare. A few minutes later, Vice President Thomas Marshall joined prominent suffragists for a signing ceremony in his office in the Capitol. Van Tyne was there to capture the moment. The photos you see on this slide were not taken by Harry, but an unidentified photographer. Harry is one of the photographers in the photo. He is right there. Where am I? And was on hand at the Dempsey Carpentier World Championship for the first ever $1 million gate. Carpentier, a Frenchman and world light heavyweight champion, was 20 pounds lighter than Jack Dempsey, who is a world heavyweight champion. The fight took place in Boyles Acres, Jersey City, on July 2nd, 1921. Dempsey won in the 4th round in front of 93,000 spectators, a first ever radio broadcast with 700 reporters on hand. As soon as Harry took the knockout photos, a carefully planned caper ensued to ensure that his photos would be the first to cross the ocean to be sold to newspapers in England and France. First, he put the 6 glass plate negatives in a special tin box and hopped on a motorcycle in waiting. He then drove 20 blocks to a motorboat in the New York harbor, which rushed him to a seaplane that took him to a tugboat in Montauk Point. A fellow on the boat grabbed the box and brought it to the Cunard liner that was held up waiting for this package. It took 45 minutes from the knockout to the arrival of the plates on the ocean liner. 6 days later, the photos arrived and were then published in the British and French newspapers, expenses costing the Hearst Company $1,200, but bringing in sales of $6,000. A few weeks later, Van Tyne, as part of an entourage of White House news photographers who accompanied Ford, Edison, and Firestone on a camping trip to what is now called Camp Harding County Park in Maryland. Quote, "I recall the first time I ever made Edison's picture. He was asleep, lying on the soft grass in front of his tent in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They were on a camping trip, he and his buddies, Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone. It was a unique shot, and not wishing to arouse the famous inventor, I took special precaution in making my approach, stepping lightly in fear that he would wake before I made the picture. Ford and Firestone began laughing at my antics, and the unnecessary noise only made me work faster. Fortunately, he slept on, and I obtained my picture. Later, they told me Mr. Edison was very deaf and had no precautions were necessary to preserve his slumber. When Henry Ford invited Thomas Edison to Detroit to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the incandescent bulb in 1929, Van Tyne was there to record the event. President Hoover and his party embarked on a 10-day inspection cruise to Puerto Rico and St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands on the USS Arizona on March 19, 1931. On this trip, Harry did not have a tripod for his camera. He tells the story of how he spied a trash basket beside a desk, how he turned it over onto the desk of a prominent member of the assembly, much to the member's protest and gestures, which Harry failed to understand. Does anyone recognize this charming couple? The Duke and Duchess were serving meals at the Washington Stage Door Canteen in 1943. The woman to the right is Mrs. Florence Van Tyne. President Truman had a fondness for news photographers and gave them every freedom to shoot. The photographers would always ask for quote, "just one more picture," and Truman would oblige, saying that photographers have to make a living too. The photographers formed the One More Club with Truman as its president and gave him a still and movie camera as a gift. Here is Truman taking a group photo of the photographers. And he also produced a short film, which is available on the National Archives website. Van Tine is located smack in the middle. And I want you to pay attention to the one woman here named Marion Carpenter, which I will talk about next. During World War II, many of the Washington news photographers were stationed overseas. Due to the shortage of photographers in Washington, the White House News Photographers Association opened membership to women in 1941. The first female member of the association was Jackie Martin, who would soon become the first female War Department photographer, and then serve overseas as a war correspondent. By 1945, other women would follow under Harry's leadership at the International News Photo Syndicate, employing pioneer photographers Marion Carpenter, Roberta Barrett, and Madeline Osborne. Marion was on assignment to cover President Truman, who is quoted as saying that she was his favorite photographer. Marion worked in Washington between 1944 and 1949, but never received recognition for her work. A small display of Marion and a collection of her photos and of other trailblazing female photographers are on exhibit at the Historical Society. While the association allowed women to become members in 1941, it was 20 years later, with the insistence of John F. Kennedy, that people of color were allowed membership as well. Maurice Sorrell was the first black photographer to be provided White House credentials and membership into the association. Harry often returned to Beacon throughout his life. After his father Robert's death in 1941, Harry would remain as an absentee owner of Van Tine's with the help of Gordon Wilson and later Fred Fink as managers. Gordon started selling newspapers for Van Tine's in 1919, and by the time Robert died, Gordon knew the entire operation. I don't know if anybody recognizes some of the people in this photograph, but I'd love to get their names.
What did you say that guy's name was?
So this is Gordon Wilson, and there's Harry as an older gentleman. This is 1955, but I don't know the name of any of the people in the back. Harry used the windows of the store as a gallery. One can see a retrospective of Harry's photos, including those of Harry Thaw that I showed you earlier. And there's Evelyn Nesbitt. There's his father wearing a fire uniform. And there's other pictures of the trolley, etc. This photo is from the back of the store with Wilson, Van Tine, and Louis Pavlik, who was a right-hand man to Wilson. The White House News Photographers Association hosted an annual dinner starting in 1923 and later featured winning images by association members in an annual contest, a speech by the president or other important dignitary, dinner and entertainment by top names of the day were de rigueur. Wilson was Van Tine's guest at the 1947 Association annual dinner. He was seated with Van Tine and others from the International News Photo Company. At this event, President Truman was the keynote speaker and contest judge. Entertainment that evening included the U.S. Navy Band and entertainers Jimmy Durante and George Jessel, among others. And I just circled, oops, sorry about that. I circled where you can see Gordon's name next to Van Tine. Between the early 1940s to the 60s, Harry would write to Gordon and send hundreds of photos from the Capitol. After Gordon and his wife Ethelyn died and their home was cleaned out, a box of photos was left on the curb for garbage pickup. A neighbor, Maureen Darcy, was aware of the value of the photos, saved them from the dump, and later donated them to us, the Historical Society. I know. Over 800 photos are now protected in acid-free sleeves, organized by date, and accessible to visitors and researchers at the Society, thanks to Maureen's foresight. In addition, we also recently received the collection of photos from Fred Fink. His father managed Van Tyne's after Gordon's passing and received photos from Harry of Kennedy's inauguration and funeral. Spanning 6 decades, Van Tyne worked as a reporter and photographer, traveling throughout North America and Europe, and was witness to presidents, kings, queens, and criminals alike. He embraced modern camera and film technologies, working with a variety of media, newspapers, magazines, radio, still photos, newsreels, and postcards. He worked at the International News Photo until 1958, when the company was bought by United Press International. Then he worked at Reaney Photographers in Washington until his retirement. Today, the Historical Society proudly holds the largest archive about Van Tyne and his work. It includes newspaper articles, copies of his essays, artifacts from the White House News Photographers Association, and hundreds of photos that capture the history of Beacon at the turn of the century and of our nation through the 1960s. Before I end, I'd like to make mention of the many folks at the White House News Photographers Association that has helped me along the way. In 2019, Peter, my husband, and I were invited to the White House press room and met today's news photographers. I interviewed a number of folks there and looked at old scrapbooks from the past. So here's Whitney Shefty, who's today's current president. She works for the Washington Post, and John Elswick for Associated Press. He will be here on May 6th with his wife, who's the executive director of the association, giving a talk at Reserva Bar, which I'll talk about in a minute. We also met Susie Walsh. She was a former president of the White House News Photographers Association and a Pulitzer Prize winner when she did a series of 20 photos of Clinton's impeachment hearings. And you can see she's sitting at her desk. All the news photographers have a very small, not even a cubicle, it's like literally a cubby. I have another picture to show you of what that looks like. So each photographer has a tiny little space where they can work, and the closet has where they store their ladders and their electrical equipment. We were there on a rainy day, and the photographers were waiting for Trump to have a press conference. So they had set up their equipment outside, and they protect it with umbrellas. And while we were waiting, while everyone was waiting for Trump to come out, the news photographers and reporters would wait in the press room, which we always see on television, but it's super tiny. And you can see like just how big it is. It used to be a pool. I think Truman had changed the pool into the press room. And right here is where you would stand, where you would see the press conference taking place. Now, some of you were at our open house on Saturday and met a veteran news photographer, Dennis Brack. He started working at the White House News Photographer. He started working as a White House photographer during Kennedy's assassination. He was there and witnessed it. He did not have an appropriate lens at the time. There was only one news photographer who had a telephoto lens. It was early in its technology. And that photographer was able to capture the blood on Mrs. Kennedy's skirt, if you recall those images. But Dennis was there, and that was how he got his start. And here he is when he spoke at the Historical Society. We did record that, and that will be on our website for you to enjoy as soon as I have time to put it on. But a few years ago, my husband and I visited Dennis at his home, and I interviewed him at length. And he's standing holding a camera, which is called a 4x5, which is what a typical news photographer would have used during the 30s to the 50s, or early 60s. Dennis is also the author of a book called Presidential Picture Stories, which we do have 2 copies of at the Historical Society. And it features stories about how photographers feel about presidents and how the presidents feel about them. So here it's my husband Peter and I at the White House. We're standing at the podium. If you haven't seen our exhibit yet, it's called Eyes of History, and it features 24 display panels that the White House News Photographers Association put together of compelling or seldom seen images of the contest photographs, as well as the history of Harry Van Tyne. And that will be open through May 6th. We're open on Thursdays 10 to 12 and Saturdays from 1 to 3. We're also excited to share that, as I mentioned, John Elswick and his wife Heidi will be at our closing event on May 6th from 1 to 3 at the Historical Society. And we're doing an event at the Reserva Wine Bar where they're going to do a presentation about their work in Washington. Those are ticketed event. That's a ticketed event, and you can buy the tickets on our website. And I want to thank you all for coming. Here are all the many people that I worked with over the 10 years that I worked on this project. So if any of you know me, you know that I'm always talking about Harry Van Tyne and how I can finally put it to rest. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm welcome to have any questions.
Yeah, how about questions?
Yes.
Van Tyne develop his own stuff? I said, did Mr. Van Tyne develop his own pictures?
I believe he did. We have photographs in the at the Society of the darkroom at the International News Photos, and you can see from some of the photos where the photographers have dark stains on their hands, and that was from the developer or some of the chemicals. So we do know that Harry developed film, and we have one set of his glass plate negatives. We have a set of his glass plate negatives, which is pretty exciting. Any other questions?
4x5 speed graphics is a bugger of a camera.
Yeah, it's heavy, right? Yeah. Janet?
I was wondering if you did write the book about him, and is it about to be published?
Excellent question. So when I first discovered Harry Van Tyne, I thought there would be enough information to write a story, and there definitely is. The only problem is most of the images are not owned by the White House News Photographers Association or by the Van Tyne estate, even though you saw in Louise's suitcase, the images are owned by Bettman Archives or Getty Archives. So each image, like the one of Truman with the news photographers, it would cost $225 to $500 a shot for each photograph to put in a book. So after that research, I decided not to write a book, but to do the exhibition. So, any other questions? No? Oh, yes, Emily.
Out of all of the images that you have seen that Harry Van Tyne took of Beacon, which one is your personal favorite out of all of his body work?
Interesting. Okay, the question is, of all of Van Tyne's images of Beacon, which were my favorites? I think my most favorite is the very first one that I saw of the R.T. Van Tyne store, where you see his reflection, and it also brings to mind my relationship with Bob, because Bob was also a photographer as well as his father, and Bob was a steward of our photograph collection. So it was an important image to me on many levels. You know, my connection and my friendship with Bob, and he was my mentor. But also that was a seminal photograph for me to start on my research. And the fact that his little tiny reflection in the window just brought out this whole body of work. But Van Tyne's work as a photographer was not the romantic, picturesque kind of work. Like there's another photographer of other postcards in Beacon. I don't know his first name, but you might. Dart. He was a Newburgh photographer. Dart, D-A-R-T. And he had more romantic views of the mountain and the city. Van Tine's images were more photojournalistic, which is exactly what he ended up doing as his career. So they're like, here's the mountain, here's the DAR monument. You know, there's nothing romantic about it. So none of them are, to be honest, particularly striking, but I think they're straight on shots that tell the story, tell the people, tell the events. I do like the photographs of Ben, though, Ben the horse, because those are fun. Yes, Peter. Well, Van Tine dies in 1968, and he does sell it to Mr. Truffaut. He continues on with the same name. So I don't know when the Truffaut's, I don't know what
How
time.
many of you remember Van Tine, being Van Tine?
I remember it as Gene Sandy.
Gene and Sandy.
Yeah. And I don't think they changed the store very much. I think they added like lotto or whatever, lottery tickets, which were, a big seller. Does anybody remember going to Van Tine's stationery store? What do you remember about it, Peter? Mm-hmm. And school supplies?
I can remember ordering the labels for the Beacon Historical Society newsletter there.
Really?
Yes, they sold the labels.
Oh,
They could
wow.
issue any kind of stationery, office supply product that you needed. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, Tom.
Diane, first of all, that was a really great presentation.
Thank you. Wait, let me get, hold on, let me put the microphone on because we have the.
Oh, sure. So I was going to say, I was really fascinated by the story of filming movies up on Mount Beacon and just kind of what you learned, just in the research about that.
Sure. So in 1909, D.W. Griffith wasn't really a known director at that point. He was making silent movies and came to Beacon for a number of reasons. The Fugitive was a Civil War story, and Mount Beacon looks just like Lookout Mountain in Tennessee, where a Civil War battle. I can't say those three words together. Civil War battle took place. So it looked just like Mount Beacon. So it was close to New York City. They would take the boat up the river, and then they take the trolley up to the mountain, and then they take the incline to the top. So it had all the amenities. They had the hotel. So they did. D.W. Griffith was here for 3 films, and actually this Red Man's View featured Mary Pickford's sister Lottie Pickford, and her partner in crime in the film. They ended up secretly marrying. So there's a lot of plots and twists that go on with these films. But Mary Pickford was on the mountain, and there was a fire. I think there was some kind of fire. There's a lot of stories about that. But we do have the 3 silent films in our collection. You can also find them on YouTube if you just Google D.W. Griffith, Mount Beacon, something like that. Oh, Craig, yes.
Do you know if Harry actually owned that speed graphic that he used, or whatever happened to it?
Louise, his granddaughter, owns one camera. It would have been an earlier camera. It wouldn't have been one that he would have used at the White House. The one that Dennis Brack was holding, that was his own 4x5 speed graphic. So, but I've never, seen it. There is, that was Marion Carpenter. Okay, any other questions?
Someone like that certainly would have owned a camera of that sort. Someone like that would have certainly owned a camera of that kind. They would have absolutely had to.
The 4x5?
Yeah, they would.
Oh, yeah.
But the interesting thing about one of the photos you showed, the one with the group of people, I'll take it, at the firehouse, is this something that a photographer would ordinarily notice? Did you notice anything about his position among the firefighters in the picture? He's slightly out of place in one of the rows, which indicates he's the one who took the picture and set the camera up and then ran into the photo, very possibly.
It's interesting you say that, because so many of the pictures where Harry is lined up, he's always the third person in the line.
So if he set that camera up, a lot of photographers wind up that way in group photos because they set the camera up either on a timer or have somebody else standing behind the camera, and they run into the photo where people have already lined up, and they wind up in an odd position like that in the row. I just wonder whether that happened there.
That's a good question. I always do wonder who took that photo. But there were other photographers in Beacon. There was 2 studios. There was Kramer, and I think Kramer was first, and then Walker. And then there were earlier photographers like Bud and others that were here. So it could have been a studio photographer that took the group photos like that. But we know that Harry went to the parades, so he would have taken photos in other places as well. Yes, Mary McTammany, Newburgh historian.
Did Harry take any panoramic photos that you know? We have Jake Rubin at the same time frame in Newburgh, who also did hundreds of postcards. And his postcards look like Harry's. They are straight on, still shots, meant to depict something that a tourist would take home or send to Aunt Bertha. But he also took a lot of panoramic photos of Newburgh that exist at events, just here comes the train and let me take the entire length of it. They're really marvelous. They're expensive to produce. They were usually 5 shots. It was a special camera that went snap, 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 and then could print the tiled image. But we love the Jake Rubin panoramas. Do you have Harry panoramas?
We have one sheet. The question about panoramas, the one I've only seen one, and we actually have it in our collection. It's of the view of the mountain, and it's just two panels. So that's the only one that I'm familiar with.
We have one picture.
When you talked about Harry jumping into the picture, and I agree, where he's setback number 3, I think he jumped in. But we have one picture where there's a little boy on the left of a giant family grouping, and he's also on the right. And so it looks like twin children in that family. But the boy understood how the panoramic camera worked, and he stood on the left, then ducked down, dashed like a rabbit to the other side of his family, and popped up again.
Right. I wish we had something like that, but we don't. That's a good question. Thank you so much.
We could not afford to hire someone to do this kind of research. We just simply couldn't. We don't have the money to do it. It takes passion, it takes a dedication, and it takes an unbelievably supportive spouse. Where is poor Peter? He's here tonight. Thank you, Peter, for sharing Diane with us. We're so fortunate to have her. You mentioned that he's a little sick of hearing about maybe Harry Van Tine. Okay, well, here's your new shirt you have to wear when you come in.
Oh, no.
So, all right, so that's one little gift. It says, warning, may start talking about history. Okay. And a second little gift, whoops, hopefully that didn't break. I'm the eternal optimist. I should have had these prepared and ready to go. Do not, for 1 minute, ever think that anyone here takes you for granted. When we needed a president, she stepped forward and did that for 3 years. And you can see the love she has for Beacon and its history and its story. Isn't it remarkable, the research she did as a volunteer on this presentation? So I am a crier, that's known. So sometimes you forget that you are awesome, but this is an official reminder. So I'm giving you that too, okay? Yeah. And then one last gift, which is hopefully not broken. Given that we were talking about photographer, I had to send her home with a photograph in front of her exhibit from this weekend. Oh, so, yeah. Great job. Great job. And we can't wait for book 2 when you find even more about him, because I have a feeling you're not about to leave Harry alone forever. So,
One thing
sure.
If I could have my druthers, I would have loved if Louise came to the exhibit or comes sometime this month. And I wish I could go back and go in that suitcase and look at everything. Yeah.
Come our way.
Yeah. Now that I know so much more about the work that he did. So that would be super fun. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
So there were several references tonight in Diane's presentation to our collection, and you see how it grows. People donate things to us from their families. People remove things from the sidewalk where they're being thrown out. Items that have Beacon provenance that end up across the country come back to us inexplicably in the mail. That's how our collection grows. But I'm so grateful to all of you for coming out and helping us to raise awareness of Beacon's history. But I want to remind you that we're all volunteers. None of us are paid. As I said, we couldn't afford to pay Diane for what she does. We couldn't afford to pay Barbara for what she does as our secretary, managing our database and other things that our folks do behind the scenes. We're all volunteer. Donations do make a difference to us. There's a little donation box on the way out. And if you're not yet a member, I'm asking you tonight to please consider joining us. It's just $25 a year. One of our volunteers can take your payment tonight, or you can do it on the website. You get a monthly newsletter. You get 10 lectures a year, invitations to special events. But most important, you're helping us to raise awareness of Beacon's history. At a time when the city is changing so much, when the community is changing so much, it's a great problem to have, right? That we've got so much growth and interest in Beacon. But if we don't preserve the essence of what we are as a community, why will people want to come here anymore? The community we know and love will be gone and obliterated if we don't remember people like Harry Van Tyne. So one last round of applause for Diane again. Okay. We have membership brochures and a donation box at the door, and you are welcome to stay as long as you'd like. We're so grateful that you're here tonight. Diane gets the last word.
Yeah. My last word is thank you, Diane Murphy, for helping me put up the display. She ran up and down the stairs about 50 times. Go get this, go get that. And she has a vision. She's the voice of reason. So I want to thank you so much for your help. And my husband, Peter, for being with me every step of the way through this process. I'm sure he's relieved that I can put Harry Van Tyne to rest. Thank you for coming this evening.
Thanks, Peter.